Many things in space are assumed to be true or unquestionable until we actually travel there and discover them for ourselves. Come with me as we investigate how astronauts survive in space. Space travel from Earth. On some level, I'm sure that some of you out there right now and many people back in the day before NASA and such think that living in space would be very similar to living on Earth. After all, many of the necessities for our survival in space are no different from those on Earth. We require food, water, exercise, stimulation, rest, bathroom use, and a long list of other necessities. Yet, what is lost in the shift is the fact that even though these prerequisites are still necessary, it does not follow that you can simply launch into space and begin carrying them out as you would any other task. And scientists had to discover that throughout the long space program, both in a simple, challenging, and unexpected way. Now, the answer to the question of whether there are people residing in space at this time is yes. The International Space Station, a real station that is now orbiting Earth and rotates the entire planet every 90 minutes, is currently occupied by 6 people. We've learned a lot about space life from that station, including certain aspects that nobody anticipated when they made the decision to live in space permanently. After all, you feel good when you're on Earth and going about your day, but what happens when you travel into space? You have the feeling of a feather. The body's response to microgravity. Now let's address the issue that has been hiding in plain sight. The absence of gravity in space is the primary distinction between full-time residents on Earth and full-time residents in space. Or, in the case of those residing on the International Space Station, there is microgravity, which is a very low level of gravity in comparison to that experienced on Earth. There is a significant adjustment that all astronauts must make. And while floating in the air and having no weight may be enjoyable and freeing, it can be difficult to maneuver around a ship or station and complete tasks, even as simple as eating. In order to adapt to the effects of microgravity and learn how to move around in space, astronauts literally have to retrain their bodies and brains. Because you can't move forward in space by thrashing your arms and legs around. Well, maybe you could if you spun around and such. You have to launch yourself off of something. So even moving about causes a significant change, and that's the only aspect of gravity to be wary of. See, we don't consider what gravity actually affects to our bones, muscles, etc., since we are so accustomed to it here on Earth. We therefore didn't consider what would happen if we left them up there for a long time without anything literally weighting them down when we started to send the first groups of people on the International Space Station. We were therefore shocked when they returned, since their bones and muscles were substantially weaker, even though they were otherwise fine. Because of how gravity works on Earth, our bones and muscles are accustomed to a certain level of pressure or resistance, and by pushing through it, we become stronger. Nevertheless, that doesn't occur in space. As a result, astronauts must undergo a demanding training session every single day to ensure that they don't have weak muscles and brittle bones when they return to Earth. They need to do this so badly that there is a real gym on board the International Space Station where they can work out. Amazing, isn't that? As you can see, though, this was merely one of the issues that needed to be resolved by hands-on encounters in space. Food and drinking water. Food and water, or given that gravity most obviously has an impact on both food and water as a whole, one could argue that this is the other significant distinction between life on Earth and life in space. You've probably seen films of astronauts having fun manipulating objects in zero gravity, such as water that stays in a spherical or food that is floating away. All of these things are factual and correct. Zero gravity prevents water from simply being poured into anything, hence all liquids on the station are packaged and may only be distributed through straw-like protrusions on the containers themselves. But the astronauts must exercise extreme caution since, if they are not careful, the water might enter the station's different systems and cause harm. Luckily, the availability of food has greatly improved. Once upon a time, tubed food was the only type of food permitted on the station which tastes as delicious as it does. Yet they couldn't risk doing anything else, and given the current conditions of the space, cooking is definitely not a good idea. Hint, the gases may blow everyone up. Fortunately, they discovered a new approach in the form of freeze-dried foods. All the different meals are prepared on Earth, freeze-dried, and sent into space. The astronauts can then enjoy themselves for the most part, at least by adding water. The water makes the food mushy, and because zero gravity has an effect on the brain, the flavor of the food has to be intensified. Yet, if the choice was between tube food and soggy food with a variety of flavors, I think it is clear which option I would choose. And I'll wager I could decide what you wanted too. Be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel before we continue to break down astronauts' daily life. Sleep schedule. Here's another item that, in all honesty, needed to be learned by experience. How often would an astronaut sleep in space, after all? Although the question may seem simple, as the occupants of the International Space Station demonstrate, it's actually not the easiest thing to accomplish. How would you determine the time, for instance, if you were on a station that orbited the Earth every 90 minutes? As a result, they will theoretically have spent 16 days in space orbits inside the 24 hours that they spend on Earth time. Not to add that the astronauts on the ISS come from a variety of different countries rather than just one, as the station itself is multinational, its construction and funding and such. How then do you convince them to agree on something? They chose the simplest solution possible and set all of the clocks on the ISS to the same time zone, in particular London time. But even after figuring it out, there was still work to be done. Because the impacts of the outside world as well as the person's actions affect how the body regulates sleep. Yet, because you orbit the Earth every 90 minutes, the sun and moon rise and set rather fast in space. Actually, astronauts select when to sleep and when to wake up, with a few exceptions, such as everyone being up during the morning meaning to plan out the day. It's a little more unpleasant how they sleep. To be blunt, astronauts snooze in airtight containers. Of course, they need to have breathing spaces, but they also need to have little, enclosed spaces where they can float without worrying about being flung into the station or bumping into something dangerous. Some people even bind themselves to the box portions themselves to prevent escape. Taking a shower and going to bathroom. Let's discuss another issue that occasionally gets overlooked in the excitement of space travel. Primarily, how to use the lavatory and how to take a shower in places like the ISS. Fortunately, it's not as difficult as you might anticipate, although it is somewhat aggravating given how simple it may be to accomplish such tasks here on Earth. Astronauts have two choices, starting with the shower. The first alternative is for them to take a hand bath, if you will, using the water from the various packets they have used to soak their clothes and towels, which does work in space because gravity doesn't totally halt the absorption of water into the towels. The astronauts can also use the shower on the station, although the given shower head only disperses the water a short distance, thus they must hold the shower head up close to their bodies to feel the water spraying them. Although it's not the simplest choice, at least you can accomplish it. While using the toilet is much simpler than you might imagine, there are some drawbacks. You can't just sit down on the toilet in space, of course. Everyone would not want to see you float up before your business was taken care of. Instead, the toilet includes grips so you may hold on to it while you use the lavatory, or you can strap yourself inside the toilet to keep you from wandering off. Oh, and when you flush the toilet, no water is used to remove your waste. Instead, it uses negative pressure to absorb everything. Do you want to hear something a little bit revolting? In the International Space Station, ISS, the astronauts' pee is really recycled to maintain the station's water flow. As they can't simply import water, they must make do with what they have. The leftover water from meals and other events is recycled in the same way. Work. You actually believed that going to space would be fun? Not close at all, guy. Going up to the International Space Station indicates that you are heading there to work as a scientist. To that aim, the astronauts have a task that they must complete each and every day. In order to outline all that needs to be done throughout the day, they have a daily conference with ground control. Everything from ISS maintenance to whatever experiments need to be run or checked on is covered. Later, at the conclusion of the day, they must attend another conference with ground control, but this time they must show them how all the work is progressing and inform them of any problems. One may assume that each generation of ISS astronauts, or even shuttle astronauts in earlier flights, would become weary of their jobs given how much time they spend in space. However, keep in mind that staying active with activities like work might help you comprehend everything that is happening around you while you are in a small area without the comforts of home. In addition, it's not like they are constantly working. Entertainment. Let's face it, the astronauts wouldn't stay in space for very long if they weren't allowed to take occasional breaks and enjoy themselves. Since all work and no play makes us pretty uninteresting individuals, as we all know on Earth. Well, the size of the International Space Station enables them to enjoy themselves in a variety of ways. They can play board games, not sure how they keep the pieces from floating though, watch movies, because of course there's a TV in space, and in a very lovely personal move, make phone calls to their families. They could always glance out the window and see the Earth in all of its radiance and splendor, of course. Of course, there is a place and a time for this, and typically, it happens after all of the day's labor and experiments are finished. Yes, they must have permission to enjoy themselves, but at least they can. The future of spaceflight for humans. After watching the entire film, you might feel as though living in space is a little bit of a chore. It's true that in order to survive and prosper in space, you essentially have to relearn everything you would normally do without thinking about it. The method is changing, though, as with everything. Of course, the ultimate goal is to make space living nearly equal to Earth life. The current challenge is creating artificial gravity. As a result, everything including weight, lift, etc. is different. But if this were to be resolved, life for astronauts in orbit would be fundamentally changed in the best way possible. And we'd be one step closer to environments like the Star Wars and Star Trek spacecraft, where people experience artificial gravity as soon as they board. For the time being, however, we are able to live in space, and the experiments being carried out in locations like the ISS help us learn even more about space and what it does to our bodies in order to adjust and adapt, with the goal of eventually making it so that people don't need to put in a lot of effort to make it work. Thank you everybody for watching.